Hello, everyone. Eric Grenier here, and welcome to the 127th episode of the Writ Podcast. It's been a crazy few weeks in BC politics with news of negotiations between BC United and the BC Conservatives that fell apart, two BCU MLAs that crossed the floor over to the Conservatives, and all this happening with a little more than 4 months to go before the provincial election. So it's been high drama in British Columbia, so I had to have Richard Zussman of Global News back on the podcast this week to try to explain to me what is happening. Richard, good to talk to you again.
Yeah, Eric, I love coming on the podcast. Thanks for having me.
We last chatted, I think, in January, and it feels like that must have been a decade ago, because I think at the time we were still talking about whether the BC Conservatives were the real deal. I think the polls at the time had BCU and the Conservatives more or less tied. Now, no longer the case. Most of the polls we've seen give the Conservatives 2 to 3 times the support of BCU. The Conservatives sometimes are within 10 points, 5 points, even less, sometimes ahead of the NDP, whereas BCU seems to be heading down to 10%. So a lot has changed over the last little while, and there has been, as I mentioned, lots of new developments over the last few weeks. So why don't we start with what seemed to be the catalyst for maybe the latest round of developments, and this was the announcement from BCU that negotiations with the Conservatives had broken off for some sort of cooperation. So what was the story there?
Yeah, so it was a little bit strange considering, as you spoke to, the polls have really evolved here. The Conservatives are polling in the high 20s, low 30s, in essence, universally based on whatever polls you look at. BC United is polling somewhere in the teens. So there's a big gap that's emerged here. And then there started to be this growing conversation about vote splitting. So if both these parties run 93 candidates across the province, inevitably they are going to be drawing from similar voters, and that will make it easier for the NDP to pick up not just their core seats, but seats in places they never would have considered winning in the past. Kamloops, Prince George, Kelowna. And that clearly would hand David Eby another majority government for the NDP and make his road to election in October quite simple. And so based on these conversations, it emerged that, BC United and the Conservatives need to be having conversations. And like anything in politics, yes, you watch the polls, you watch policy, but you also have to watch the personalities. And John Rustad was thrown out of the BC Liberal Caucus. That's what the party used to be called before this rebrand. When Kevin Falcon became the leader, they launched this rebrand, and Rustad was an outsider, an independent MLA who joined the Conservatives. He then lured another MLA, Bruce Bandman, from BC United, and they operated here at the legislature in essence as a party of two. Their popularity started growing, and then these conversations started of like, does this actually work? What does it look like during an election? Do we need to merge? Is there any appetite for that? Do we need to have non-compete agreements, in essence, where, in one riding, a BC United candidate runs with no Conservative and vice versa in another? Even the idea of a popular mayor in Metro Vancouver, Brad West, that idea popped up. Well, maybe we need to think outside the box and find someone who's well liked in this province to run, in essence, an alternative campaign to David Eby. It was something West quickly rejected the idea of, but all these ideas were percolating. And then all of a sudden, we had this surprise Friday press conference where Kevin Falcon comes out and says, not only have we been negotiating, which the public had a sense of, but we actually had a framework here that's been rejected. And, for political junkies like you and I, it was fascinating to look at the terms of this deal, like the idea that there would be a non-compete agreement, that incumbents would be protected. So if you were BC United or Conservative incumbent, somebody from the other party wouldn't run against you. And then for all of those other ridings, they would have a draft. So the Conservatives would get the first 2 or 3 picks. Then BC United would get 1, then the Conservatives could get 2 or 3, and then United would get 1 in order to offset that incumbency thing. It was fascinating to think how that would work. Ultimately, though, it never had a hope. With the Conservatives polling in the 30s and BC United polling in the teens, the Conservatives said, we want to roll the dice here. We are now the option for the center-right voters. BC United is irrelevant to voters. They are unfamiliar with the name. They don't like the leader, and Kevin Falcon. You look at that poll after poll. His numbers are terrible when it comes to his own popularity. He's running negatives in some cases in the 30s and 40s, which, for people familiar with polling is really, really bad for when it comes to name recognition. So it was a fascinating deal to sort of think about how it would work. And then the agreement would be, well, after we run this election where we don't run against each other, whoever gets the most seats here, the leader gets to be the premier in a coalition if combined they had more than the NDP. And the public doesn't really like the idea of these prescribed coalition talks. In essence, you're limited on who you can vote for. It may not be a party you support. You may be stuck with that person as premier. So it was fascinating to watch, and clearly a deal the Conservatives just didn't think was good enough for them to sign on for.
Why did the BCU offer these terms? Because there was reporting that the Conservatives had approached the BC United last fall when the polling was a little bit more even. But the terms of this deal was the terms of two equal parties, and really more slanted towards BCU, since a lot of their incumbents, which are in big danger of being defeated by Conservatives, not by New Democrats, were going to be saved. So it almost seems like this was maybe the starting place, because I can't imagine they thought this is where they would end up.
No, it was a real sense of desperation, it seemed. And the fact that conversations didn't go on showed how far apart they were. And I've heard from a number of organizers who were really, really angry that Kevin Falcon released the details of these negotiations in the way that he did. It's even led to a few people walking away from helping BC United to help the Conservatives. And why do it, I think, was an attempt to send a message to the public that BC United wanted to be seen as the only party willing to engage here, the only one willing to admit that the parties needed to work together to defeat David Eby. Kevin Falcon trying to come off as someone who was looking at the party over one's own self. That did not resonate with people. I think that was his attempt, but I don't think largely the public saw it that way. They saw it as desperate, and they saw it as someone just trying to hold on to the last grasps of power before it slipped through his hands. And then subsequently, we've seen that slippage happen, as we see, as you described, some of his candidates, some of his MLAs, BC United MLAs, now move, and they're going to run for the Conservatives in the election.
Was there ever a time when the Conservatives would have agreed to something like this?
I think there probably was some sort of conversation that could have happened, but you need to remember, back to the issue of personalities, these groups don't like each other. And a lot of the people who are building behind the Conservatives felt mistreated by BC Liberals, then BC United. There are many that don't like Falcon. There was some hurt feelings from the leadership. Aaron Gunn is running for the federal Conservatives in the next election, but before that, he put his name out there to run against Kevin Falcon for the BC Liberal leadership. And he was told by the party, you are not eligible to run because of comments he had made around reconciliation. Aaron Gunn reflects in this province, and by extension this country, a new wave of conservatism, speaks to a younger demographic that feel that government has not supported them, that feel like decisions made by the Prime Minister and by premiers have left them without the same opportunities that their parents and grandparents had in this country. And Pierre Poilievre has tapped into this conservatism, and Aaron Gunn had as well. And by throwing him out of the BC Liberal big tent, it moved him and his supporters, his organizers, his friends to something else. And they found a home with the Conservatives. And that tension point, that disagreement between the sides, makes it more difficult to believe there was going to be some sort of agreement between them. But I think there was room there. You know, it's in politics, in order to have any power, you need to win. And you're looking at the maps now and you're saying, well, there are going to be splits and there are going to be openings here for the NDP because of splits in Kamloops and Kelowna and Prince George, as I mentioned, but beyond that, in Kitimat, in Williams Lake, in Revelstoke, in Cranbrook, like these places that are traditionally federally conservative. They were places that in part were some of the birthplaces for the Reform Party. Like the history in these ridings goes back a long, long way. And now it opens the door for the idea that an NDPer can win because the 60% of the vote that normally goes to a Conservative party will be split between BC United and the Conservatives. So yes, at some point there was probably some room, but there's just so much history involved here. You know, the way the party fragmented, the way the Conservatives rose up, the way that Kevin Falcon is disliked, all of that makes it, you know, hard to believe that it was going to be a bringing together of minds. But now there's no hope for any of that. And you even hear now Conservative strategists talking about this is a, 5-year plan, not a 1-year get elected in October plan, but let's disrupt the right, establish a free enterprise coalition as they describe it, and then get ready to defeat the NDP in 2028, which for a lot of organizers and voters, it's hard to believe you're going to put in 100% when you don't even think you're going to win.
We'll see if voters are going to, continue to have the move over to the Conservatives that we've seen in the polls. But we've already seen, as I mentioned, a few actual MLAs make that move, and it does seem that it has been motivated by the polls. So there is Lauren Dirksen, Eleanor Sturko, who announced over the last week that they were crossing the floor from BC United over to the Conservatives. So what was behind their move and their decision to make this pretty big leap?
What makes it fascinating is it is two very different situations. So sometimes when you see floor crossing en masse, they come from similar ideals. I remember being in Alberta covering the big migration to the Wild Rose. And those candidates came from similar places in the province. They reflected similar ideas. Here, these are two very different people who reflect two very different parts of the party. And I think that's what makes it interesting because they're both motivated by the same idea, which is there wasn't a deal to be made. There needs to be just one strong Conservative voice on the ballot. And we both believe that that is the Conservative Party of BC and not BC United. Let's start with Dirksen because he went first. So he represents a more rural community. The riding is mainly made up of the community of Williams Lake and surrounding areas. Dirksen is a one-term MLA. He was the caucus chair for BC United. He is beloved in caucus. He was a team player. He's a constituency MLA. Didn't get a whole lot of media attention, didn't spend a whole lot of time on his feet up in question period, but was one of those guys that, would help out other candidates in the region, would spend time, working with the BC United caucus to understand rural issues. And he got tremendous pressure from his riding association, BC United Riding Association, that basically said, we're not helping you in this election. We're all going to the Conservatives and we want you to come with us. And it played out over about 48 hours. I was ready at 5 minutes to 6, right before our newscast, to report that he was crossing the floor the next day. I had found out that he was getting ready to board a plane and come to Victoria for the announcement. And I was told 5 minutes before that he had changed his mind, that he had gotten cold feet, that he was so nervous about it. And I subsequently talked to Lauren about it. And at 5:55 p.m. on the Thursday, that was the case. And then by 7:30, the Riding Association had called up again and put more pressure on him. And all of a sudden he says, do you know what? It's time to make that move. So he made that decision largely driven by that voice in a more rural community in British Columbia saying we need a unified voice and it's behind the Conservatives. Eleanor Sturko is a totally different story. So a star brought in by Kevin Falcon, given huge profile in the legislature. She was an RCMP spokesperson before she was a politician. She was on television a lot. She came here. She had relationships with reporters. She had an ability to speak, and she championed those issues around decriminalization that we're now seeing Pierre Poilievre echo a lot of the same terminology that Eleanor Sturko started with, which was, drugs are dangerous. Drugs are killing people. We shouldn't be giving people drugs through a prescribed drug supply program that's led to what's called drug diversion. And decriminalization is making it very hard for police to ensure that people are safe in public because of the policies. And she drove that message, got a lot of local and national attention for it. She appeared before a parliamentary committee in Ottawa to speak on the issues. The other big part about Eleanor Sturko was that she is gay. And she speaks about her wife and their children and raising kids with two moms. And that was important for Kevin Falcon because they had an issue in their caucus with homophobia. And it was seen as, look, if they can get Eleanor Sturko, BC United is a new BC United. And the Conservatives have been criticized for having homophobic candidates, for attacking a program here in our school system that provides resources for teachers to teach around LGBTQ plus issues. Well, now all of a sudden, Sturko says, I'm okay with the Conservatives. And she's been criticized since that decision by members of the LGBTQ plus community. And Sturko says, well, we're not all the same. I have concerns with parts of SOGI. I can't be lumped in with all gay people in this province, but still, it is a message around somebody willing, even though there may be homophobic people around her, to embrace conservatism from her background. Urban seat, Surrey South, sure, it's suburban, and you do have some big sort of rural properties there, but it is the city of Surrey, fastest growing city in the province, second biggest city in British Columbia behind Vancouver. So it's a very different situation, and hers really is motivated by winning. Like she again, new MLA, 2020, first elected. She quit this job with the RCMP. She needs this job. And so she made it clear that I believe I have a much better chance of winning with the Conservatives than BC United. So she pulled the plug as well. She's running in a different riding now, Surrey Cloverdale. So right beside her Surrey South riding. Part of it, I think 9 blocks or so carries over based on, changing electoral maps. But yeah, it's fascinating because it's so two distinct reasons ultimately coming to the same conclusion.
I mean, I'm sure this is the obvious next question, but will these be the last two? Because it does seem that there is some complication, because you mentioned Sturko is going to be running in a neighboring riding, in part because there's already a Conservative candidate in Surrey South, and the Conservatives have candidates already across the province. It's a lot to ask someone who might have signed up when the party was at 15, 20% in the polls that they should now step aside now that they're at 30, 35%. But are we going to see more BCU MLAs present themselves in the next election as Conservatives?
They were nominating people when they were at 5% in the polls. And they nominated a lot of people. And different types of candidates are attracted to a party polling at 5% than a party polling at 32%. And I've spoken a number of times to Conservative leader John Rustad about exactly this. He has a very different impression of a star candidate than is traditional. And, we often see a star candidate as, a mayor, a police chief, another elected official, even a floor crossing. He sees stars as members of our community, he calls them, right? A local lawyer, somebody who works in the local home hardware. It's just a local person who cares about the community. And so it's interesting that way. And then it comes down to the math like you described. So he's nominated more than 70 candidates. That they don't have a lot of seats left. They for sure don't have a lot of places left in ridings where they are winnable for the Conservatives. So that makes it harder. There are 13 BC United MLAs running again. I have gone over in my head again and again and again the situation for all 13. I have spoken to as many of those 13 who will pick up the phone or respond to my texts. The sense I get is these are the last remaining 13, that they are loyal for different reasons. Some of them are the architects to the rebrand from Liberal to United. In the case of Shirley Bond, she is a legend in this province. She has been an MLA since first elected 2001. She was a high-profile BC Liberal cabinet minister throughout Gordon Campbell and Christy Clark. Like someone like that just would never change. The thing to watch, I think, more closely will be the candidates. Will there be BC United candidates in those open spots who are ready to move over? And John Rustad has described that he's kept a few seats open. There's a few in Langley that are open. I think there's one in the north that's open where you could see some of that movement. Everyone, in essence, has been offered an opportunity already to move to the Conservative, and it comes back to the point that you made, right? You get an offer when the Conservatives are polling at 12 or 15%, you turn it down, but are willing to take the offer when they're in the 30s, and the Conservatives are probably like, well, that offer's not on the table anymore like it used to look like. It's a much different bargaining position. So I ask the same question you do. Who's next? I don't think anybody's next, but I also 3 weeks ago would have been stunned if you told me Eleanor Sturko was going to be a Conservative. So a lot can happen. There's names. Tom Shapitka is the one that everybody talks about. He's in Cranbrook. He has a lot of personal connections to Rustad and the Conservatives, but he's the one that's been offered it the most and has turned it down the most. And he is loyal. And this is every time we talk, he speaks to his loyalty. And it's almost a willingness at some point that you go down with the ship and then see where things settle when it's all over. And then maybe you become a Conservative for the next go around if it really is a 2-election cycle. And then the other one I think about often is Michael Lee, ran for leadership against Kevin Falcon. He's almost a guy who would be more willing just to quit politics than to run for the Conservatives. And if there's a prevailing sense of what is even the point here, that our party is in such trouble, let's walk away. We haven't even talked about the idea still that Kevin Falcon still believes he can win. Like there still is a belief, even polling at 12, 13, 14%, he somehow still believes that people are confused about the Conservatives. They think it's Pierre Poilievre. Eventually they'll realize they're not, that he is a seasoned politician, and that people are mad at the government over issues like healthcare and affordability and the housing crisis and cost of living, all of those things. So it seems when you're polling at 13 and 14%, it seems delusional. But he still goes about talking publicly and privately that he still thinks there could be a turnabout here. I don't know. Eric, you've watched polls longer than I have. It would be the most unlikely of unlikely turnarounds in Canadian political history. But he's still trying to put up that fight before October 19th.
Yeah, I can't imagine. I can't think of a lot of examples where you go from 13% to winning. Anything's possible. Rachel Notley came back from pretty far, but I don't think she was that far. And when you talk about that loyalty, you do wonder if the loyalty will still hold when we get a poll that has BCU in single digits, which feels like that could be any time now. Yeah. The one thing I wanted to get a bit more information from you on is that we talk a lot about whether the Conservatives have any ability to turn these polls into actual votes, right?
Yeah.
They don't have as much money as BCU. They don't, at least we'll see what the latest quarter says, but in the past they haven't raised nearly as much money. They don't have the big public subsidy that BCU has. Are we getting a sign that the Conservatives will have actual structure, actual organization to get some of this vote out? If BCU is only at 12%, it's probably not going to make that big of a difference. But in some ridings, Conservatives are probably going to need a few extra votes just to get past the NDP candidate.
Yeah, it will make a big difference. Even at 12%, the vote split comes into play. And as you know, it's not 12% in every riding. They may be down at 3 or 4% in some of these ridings where the NDP is surging. And in the ridings where we have the splits, they could be closer to 20 or 25. And that could make a huge disruption in terms of the electoral success. And I've been told that the Conservatives are breaking records every single day in terms of their fundraising. They recently held a big event in Surrey where they had their best single day fundraising since since they've become the BC Conservatives. All of that, they are expecting to be ahead of BC United for the next quarter. Again, I'll believe it when I see it. I'll believe that when I see it. They are starting to get organizers coming. And it's not just people in British Columbia. They have recruited some organizers, I understand, from Alberta, from Manitoba, from Ontario. In Manitoba, there were some who had moved over from Stephenson after that electoral defeat, looking for opportunities here. In Alberta, I understand there have been some people who helped Danielle Smith get elected, who don't have jobs in government, who have come here to help. So that helps the Conservatives with some experience in terms of connecting with voters. But you need money to win elections. You need to have the software to identify vote. You need to ensure that you run campaigns and have money for signs and all of this. And they are still well behind where they need to be, but it's coming. Will they be able to get there fast enough? I'm not sure. And that's going to be one of the big tests. And Kevin Falcon still believes that they have a massive advantage on money and organization. And that's shifting a bit, but they have a multi-million-dollar head start over the Conservatives. They have run ads here in the province as part of their rebrand. They did not go particularly well, but we're going to see another blitz, and they need to decide BC United does, whether it's an attack on the Conservatives that they want to launch, or do they want to target David Eby, which is really who they're trying to defeat. This is where they're a bit lost, I think, the BC United in terms of their strategy. So the money question will be key to watch. You're right to note that the next quarter is going to be the crucial quarter. How often we see money follows polls. As parties surge up the polls, the money then comes. We haven't yet seen that with the Conservatives, but we also have really seen their biggest surge come in this last quarter. So early indications are they're having some success, but is it the grassroots type of stuff that you need where, a granny in, what community haven't I mentioned yet? In Fort St. John decides that she's going to, use $20 a month from her pension to help the candidate in the local community and John Rustad get elected. These are the sort of people you need. You hear these stories every election that you need these sort of people to show up and say, I'm willing to, not just vote for you, but put some of my hard-earned money in your pocket so that you can run an effective campaign to, in this case, defeat David Eby and the NDP.
That's one of the things I wonder about too. You mentioned the riding association with Dirksen, whether there's going to be a lot of enthusiastic volunteers and where that energy is going to be, because it would seem that the energy is largely going to be with the Conservatives. What was it? The communications person from BCU talking about working on the deck of the Titanic. Not a really very motivating thing, and I assume that a lot of volunteers might feel the same way.
Yeah, and he was joking with friends, but it's these are the sort of jokes you make when you're worried about your job. Yeah, like these are the sort of things you try to do to lighten up a mood that is pretty dour at this point. And you're right. And the other thing we haven't even talked about, and we're running out of time really, but this hemorrhaging of federal liberals. In essence, every federal liberal who I know who has been prominent members of the BC Liberals here, and even a little bit BC United in the early days, have all left. They have, in essence, abandoned that. And those are organizers who are connected largely in Metro Vancouver to really important electoral bases that are needed for success. And all of those federal Liberals have left BC United. And some of these staunch Conservatives are now joining Conservatives, but it's leaving BC United lacking with energized volunteers and organizers, again, which you really need to have electoral success.
We can finish on this then. We haven't really mentioned them much. The NDP, how are they feeling in the midst of all this? Polling support seems to be getting a little softer, but they're still leading in the vast majority of polls. But how are they feeling about this? Would they have preferred that these two parties continue to bicker rather than one starts to take off?
For sure. And you're going to hear the terminology. Just this week, I heard Health Minister Adrian Dix for the first time refer to the previous government as the Liberal Conservative government. Like, I've covered politics a long time in this province, and I have never heard that before. So it's not just a reference to the previous BC Liberal government. They're now making up this idea that it was a Liberal Conservative government. So we're going to hear more of that from the NDP, no doubt. They are, in essence, focus grouping it in real time to see what the feedback is like, and we will see how people react to that sort of terminology. I still struggle so much with this idea that when people are polled, they say they want change, but they still support the NDP. And as you know, Eric, that's often creates a really muddy electoral projection. And if there wasn't such significant splitting on the right, David Eby would have a really hard time winning re-election. But the splitting exists. And so he's trying to hit some of those core issues to people on housing, affordability, healthcare, and see if it resonates. And saying, well, yes, our party's been in power, but it hasn't been me. And I have the solutions to help move us forward.
All right. Well, the summer's coming. Just quick, what's the big question that you're looking to see answered over the next few months before the campaign officially starts?
Yeah, so one of the ones you brought up, who's next? Will more Conservatives go over to BC United? That's huge. Is David Eby having a boy or girl? His wife is pregnant and the baby is supposed to arrive at some point in the next few weeks. And on the political calendar, that's going to lead to a break. And then when he returns, that's really going to be the push to the campaign. So it'll be interesting to see tonally what David Eby is pushing when he gets back onto the campaign trail. So that's going to be interesting in the summer to watch. But it really is about how do things settle on the center right of the political spectrum. And it's hard. He is so dug in. But the larger question is, does Kevin Falcon survive? And I think the answer clearly is going to be yes, he is going to stick into this. But if you continue to see candidates leave and, as you described, polling in the single digits, it becomes a little bit more challenging to get to that reality of him presenting this unified front when he gets to the campaign trail.
Well, I'm looking forward to the next time we can chat, because it feels like probably a lot will have happened if there's already so much that's happened this year. So, Richard, really appreciate it today, and looking forward again to when we can speak about this upcoming election that has really become the barn burner in 2024. So really looking forward to it.
All right, Eric. Talk soon. Thanks so much for having me.